Marga Minko is the pen name of the prominent Dutch Jewish writer Sarah Minko, who was born in the Netherlands in 1920. She started her career as a journalist with a newspaper in the Netherlands. Due to her Jewish identity, Minko was forced to go into hiding during the Second World War when Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940. She was the lone member of her family to survive the Holocaust. The Holocaust, which involved the systematic persecution of Jews in Europe, led to the death of over 75% Dutch Jews between 1940 to 1945. Those who survived lost their families and homes and underwent immense trauma. Most of Minko's works are set against this backdrop and are informed by her own experiences and that of other Jews during the war. Her first novel was Bitter Herbs, the story of a young girl who loses her whole family in the war. Some of her other works are The Other Side and An Empty House. The story, The Address, is about a woman's visit to the house of an old acquaintance of her mother's after the Second World War. She goes there to reclaim her mother's belongings, but ultimately changes her mind and leaves without taking anything with her. The story reveals the impact of war on individuals and the difficulty of coming to terms with the losses caused by it. It also comments on the futility of clinging on to old memories. Here is a summary of the story The Address by Marga Minko. The story begins with the narrator of the story standing at the door of a house, speaking to a woman who had answered the door. The narrator had travelled some distance to meet the woman. Even though the narrator introduced herself, the woman did not show any flicker of recognition. The narrator wondered if she was at the right address. Just then, she noticed that the woman was wearing a cardigan that had once belonged to her mother. The narrator was now sure that she was at the right address. The woman, however, refused to speak to the narrator and closed the door. The narrator looked again at the address just outside the door. It was what she remembered. As she walked back to the railway station, ignoring the familiarity of the streets, her thoughts went back to her mother, who had given her the address. One day, the narrator had returned home to find many things missing from their house. On inquiring about it, her mother told her that an old acquaintance, Mrs. Dorling, had turned up suddenly after several years. She had offered to safeguard their prized possessions during the war. The narrator's mother had felt rather obligated to Mrs. Dorling for taking such a big risk. The narrator then remembered the only time she had seen Mrs. Dorling. Mrs. Dorling had been on her way out of the house with a packed suitcase, and her mother had briefly introduced the two to each other. It was then that her mother had told her Mrs. Dorling's address, number 46, Marconi Street. After the war, the narrator had had little interest in the objects that had survived the war, unlike her loved ones. She had no longer felt a connection to them. However, when things had returned to normalcy, she had decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Dorling. After her unsuccessful first attempt, the narrator decided to go back again. Mrs. Dorling wasn't at home, and her daughter let the narrator into the house. On entering the house, the narrator was shocked to see the room full of things that used to be in her house before the war. She felt as if she was in a place that was familiar and strange at the same time. It was almost suffocating for her. Mrs. Dorling's daughter offered the narrator some tea, which she accepted. In a daze, the narrator struck up a conversation with the girl. She remarked how beautiful the things were, and how one tends to take one's belongings for granted until one loses or lends them. She remembered how her mother had once made her polish their silver cutlery. She asked the girl if their cutlery was made of silver too. But when the girl started to check, the narrator sprang out of her chair and decided to leave without meeting Mrs. Dorling. She realized she did not want her mother's belongings back anymore. Now that she had seen them in an unfamiliar setting, they did not hold the same value for her. Besides, she reasoned her new house was too small and shabby for exquisite antiques. As the narrator left, she confirmed the address once again. It was number 46, Marconi Street indeed. But she was determined to forget the address and never return. She wistfully realized that of all the memories she had to erase from her mind, an address would be the least difficult to forget. The main characters in the story, the address, are the narrator, her mother, and Mrs. Dorling. Click each label to learn more about the characters. The narrator is a very determined person. Even when Mrs. Dorling shows no glimmer of recognition, the narrator persists, hoping for an acknowledgement at least. After being turned away rudely the first time, she goes back a second time. Similarly, the narrator is also determined to forget the pain of the past and start life afresh. When the narrator realizes that her own belongings now seem alien to her, she decides to let them remain with Mrs. Dorling. The narrator has an excellent memory too. Her mother had told her Mrs. Dorling's address just once, yet she remembers it very clearly. Although several years had gone by, the narrator remembers the smallest of details, like the burn mark on the tablecloth and the white teapot with a golden border on the lid. The narrator's mother is a trusting and an innocent person. She does not wonder why Mrs. Dorling had re-established contact with her suddenly after several years. She genuinely believes that Mrs. Dorling was helping her and refuses to discuss the matter with the suspicious narrator. Additionally, the narrator's mother is too polite to ask any direct questions and so is easily fooled by Mrs. Dorling. Mrs. Dorling is an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother who revived their relationship during the war. She is an opportunistic person who takes full advantage of the narrator's mother's fear of having to leave her house and possessions. In addition, she is greedy and unscrupulous and does not hesitate in taking away her friend's property, all the while pretending to be doing a favor. Despite the weight of the objects, the effort involved in moving them, Mrs. Dorling takes away things almost every day. Mrs. Dorling is plain dishonest when she refuses to even talk to the narrator and says that she cannot help the narrator. She refuses to acknowledge that she has any of the narrator's property, despite wearing the narrator's mother's cardigan. Now let us examine the story closely. The story is set in an unnamed European town, most probably a town in the Netherlands. This town is the narrator's hometown. The narrative is largely set after the Second World War. Some events in the story, however, take place during the early years of the war. In this context, we can more properly evaluate the actions and emotions of the characters in the story. The major theme that runs through this story, as with most of the works of Marga Minko, is the effects of war on people. For some people, like the narrator's family, war destroys everything. Families, houses, and other things which are valuable to them. Even ordinary things like good bread or an undisturbed night's sleep stand out as signs of normalcy. The story also shows that war can bring out the worst in some people. Mrs. Dorling misuses the fears brought about by the war to take away the narrator's mother's possessions. A related theme that runs through the story is that of the identity crisis people face after a war. This is why the narrator is afraid of returning to familiar places and looking at familiar things, because they would only remind her painfully of people and places that were no longer there. Eventually, when the narrator does see her mother's things again, she feels alienated rather than feeling happy. The story also comments on the futility of clinging to memories. In the end, the narrator seems to realize that reclaiming her mother's expensive antiques would not help her come to terms with the losses caused by the war. Hence, she decides to leave behind not just the objects, but also the memories associated with them. The author has used several symbols in the story. The narrator's mother's belongings operate as symbols for all things that are disrupted by the war, especially the familiarity of home and hearth. They are also symbols of loss, which is clear when the narrator mentions that only things survived unscathed the trauma and upheaval caused by the war. The narrator's attempts to find and reclaim her mother's belongings can be considered symbolic of her attempts to find herself. After her life is uprooted by the war, she feels lost and feels that she could rebuild her identity through her mother's possessions. The story does not proceed in strict chronological order. Part of the story is set in the past, with the narrator's memories providing background and context for her actions in the present. The ending of the story is ironic. The reader expects the narrator to fight for her rightful ownership of the belongings. Instead, the narrator leaves without even meeting Mrs. Dorling and resolves never to return.